All right, so welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. The topic for today's new board member series session is the importance of policy, and we're fortunate enough to have Neola, our policy partner, here to discuss it with you. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to just put them in the chat box. We'll be monitoring that throughout the event. And we will also be sending out a recording of this webinar next week. So I will turn it over to Pat from Neola, who can tell you a little about himself and then jump into today's topic.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, introductions. I'm not alone here today, and Chris Rice, another associate with Neola, is joining us as well. So I'll introduce myself first and turn it over to Chris. My name is Pat Krieger. I'm a retired superintendent. I worked with Neola for, this will be my 5th year with them as a policy associate. My role is working directly with districts and helping guide them in policy and producing that as well as publishing it. Chris, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. My name is Chris Rice, and like Pat, former superintendent, as are all Neola associates. And I think that's one of the benefits of working with Neola is that you get that perspective from somebody who's been there, who understands the pitfalls of not keeping policies current and not adhering to the policies that you have. So we take our work very seriously, and as we encourage you to do as well. And it's very nice to be here with you today.
So as new board members, a policy sometimes can seem a little overwhelming in terms of the process. Our hope today is to guide you through an overview of what policy production looks like, how you go through making choices and recommendations, and then how you go through as a board of working through policy. So hopefully at the end of the day, you have a clearer sense of what the process is for policy. So interestingly enough, I want to start off with current trends, and Chris, please jump in as you see fit here. There's been some very interesting trends in policy the last number of years. I'll hit the first couple here. Board meetings. This was really driven out of COVID and how board meetings are structured in terms of public comments. There have been some horror stories out there of board meetings going for 8 hours and 7 of that being public comments. This was mainly back during the times of masks and school closures and things like that. So where there's some policy revisions in terms of boards really sticking to their policy in terms of how long you have to comment and the appropriateness of those comments, and limiting abusive comments. The next one's really been a hot topic actually is public complaints. And this is really around books. And there's a public complaints policy that we work with quite often in terms of how districts go about handling a complaint against instructional materials like a library book. Chris, you want to take a couple?
Yeah, sure. I appreciate that. So, I'll just kind of preface my comments on the benefit of having working with Neola is that, our policy writers, our attorney group, we're constantly monitoring legislation in Lansing, legislation in Washington, D.C., and then applying that to policy. And the beauty of it is that it provides a constant kind of a stabilizing piece for the governance and the leadership of a school district. Many of the things that you see under current trends are very much political hot buttons. And if you can avoid the controversy associated with some of these things by adopting policies that have been vetted through law, and I really believe that is a real positive for a school district. As we go down that list, student discipline and due process, and especially as that pertains to the rights of students with IEPs, Title IX, that's a big topic, obviously, and there is a rewrite coming up. We're not positive on the release, so we think we've got a little bit of time here before that happens. But that's going to be a big lift for everyone when that's released. And then, based on the outcome of the presidential election in November 24, that could end up being rewritten once again, because obviously the different parties take a different viewpoint on Title IX issues, very similar to the LGBTQ topics. AI, we just released an AI policy, last update for students. This time around, we've added staff because in the absence of that, it's kind of the Wild West. We also provide model handbooks for students. And I believe in the next update, and Pat, you can correct me, I believe it's Neola's intention in our next update coming in February or March to give you a very comprehensive policy update on prohibited subjects of bargaining as that has changed and is in the process of changing.
Yeah, I was going to touch on that too, because prohibited subjects of bargaining, the legislature overturned all the prohibited subjects of bargaining from the last administration. In doing so, all these things that were removed from contracts years ago and put into policy now could be bargained as part of a contract. So as a board member, you're going to see some ebb and flow here with subjects going into contracts or maybe not going into contracts based upon negotiation. It's going to be an interesting next go round with negotiations with respect to these.
And it may be advisable for districts who are negotiating this year to maybe hold off on those topics that we know are going to be included in the prohibited subjects language until after the policy has been released. It doesn't mean you have to wait to start, but because there are plenty of things you can talk about, but that may be advisable. Share that for consideration.
So what is Neola? So we work with over 1,500 school districts, over 450 in Michigan currently. And we provide services and bylaws and policies. And if you're not aware, bylaws are the rules by which the board operates. And the policies are the rules by which the school operates. We also have administrative guidelines that are really the marching orders that are the corollary to the policies. We also provide electronic publishing, and I'll actually show you what that looks like a little bit later in this webinar. In our update service, and Chris touched on it. So as part of our update service, I believe we have 13 associates like Chris and I in the state. And we all have a client list. And I think at this time, Chris and I probably have the two largest client lists just recently. I'm around 55 to 60 schools. I think Chris is around 50-ish. So I have a great cross section of schools from very large to very small. So it's an interesting dynamic of how policy is driven differently given on the demographics of the district. Other things, Chris mentioned the associate support. So I likely get 2 or 3 phone calls a day or emails on clarification questions from clients I work with about policy. A superintendent might call and say, hey, I need a clarification on policy 5610. That's student expulsion and suspension. I only know that so well because it comes up quite a bit. So I walk them through an interpretation of that and how it applies to their situation. So we're very much a resource. Chris, you want to add anything about?
Yeah, I did just to share that, I believe that's the benefit of using Neola's policy services over some of the other providers of policy is the accessibility of the associate, and also the fact that because we are former superintendents, we understand the policies in an applied context, right? If somebody asks, well, why do we need this? And then we can think of an application in a school setting where it fits and why it's important to have, and that might also help a district with some of the options that are available to them when it comes to updating policies.
Bylaws and policies in the Michigan Revised School Code, the general powers, the oversight of policy falls to the school district and the board and their procedures. So there's where you're given the rights to develop policies as a school. Very much so, and this is a distinction that's extremely clear, policy is the domain of the board. You work with your administration in them recommending policies to you, but as a rule, the domain of the board decides what is actually implemented in terms of policy. It is your statutory responsibility, as I just showed you in the compiled law. It's the what about your school. One really important thing about compliance, and this comes up a lot with anti-harassment, anti-discrimination. We just did an update on all of our anti-discrimination and harassment policies, probably a year and a half ago. And it was, there are 13 of them in the set, dealing with all different employment classes and protected classes as well.
Pat, Pat mentioned or shares an idea with us from time to time, and I've heard him say it in presentations, that you don't need policy until you need policy. And that's very, very, very true. Policy isn't exciting until it's exciting. But by not maintaining current policies, districts really do run some risks. There is a very high-profile situation that occurred in a district in Michigan that happens to be one of our clients, where a policy on threat assessments for students under the school safety policy 8400 was adopted, but that information did not make it to the individuals responsible for actually carrying out that policy. So that's very important, and we always stress with our administrators when we work with them and or our boards, if we work with boards directly, that someone there at the district has that responsibility to make sure that the necessary information gets to the appropriate personnel so that those policies are actually adhered to as the board has approved. And in this particular case, that did not occur. It led to 2 board members resigning in some public scrutiny, and just a very unfortunate outcome.
The line I use with people is policy is really boring until you don't have one, then it's really exciting. And it's really exciting really fast. So Chris brought up an interesting point too about not only communicating the policy with people that implement the policy, but providing them the appropriate training to do so. And training is a key component of policy. There are certain things that are required as part of policy that your staff be trained in. I'll get to that a little bit later in the presentation. So purpose of policy, it's required statutorily, it's regulatory, it provides you as a board authority and guidance for people that work in your school district. And probably the thing I think it does most is establishes guardrails or parameters for how you'll function in a whole unique set of issues. And you set a direction for your district by the policy you develop. From Neola's part, what we present you is legally compliant options, and you work through which choices are appropriate for you. So as part of that, we warrant those policies as long as you choose one of the legally compliant options. As a board, if you go off and write your own language for a policy that may be contrary to law, it is no longer warranted by us, and it becomes your responsibility.
I would just add that, when you as a board member and or even a member of the administrative team receives a question about a decision that's been made at the district level or a course of action that's been taken, the first question I would always ask is, have you checked policy? Have you looked for the appropriate policy to ensure that the district is adhering to their policy? The other thing that I would share is that policy is something that years ago, even 5, certainly 10 years ago, your communities and the public really didn't pay a whole lot of attention to, even though they're accessible to them via your websites. People are paying attention to policy today. And what we find oftentimes is that somebody's practice and someone's policy are not in alignment. So it's very critical that if there's something happening, I'll give you an example of another district that I worked with who it's a new client, and their policies hadn't been updated in a while. They actually had an administrative guideline on graduation requirements, which is part of this update, that they hadn't updated since 2010. Well, in 2010, to graduate from a Michigan high school, you only needed 3 mathematics credits, and that's what their AG said, that you can graduate with 3 math credits. Well, we know it's 4 credits. That's a really big deal, right? I mean, that's something that we've got to stay on top of. And again, just steering people back when there are questions about operations to the board adopted policies.
So the process, and this for new board members is key, because when you become a new board member, you really shouldn't have a great idea of the whole process of policy adoption. So I thought I would do a little overview here of the initial policy review meeting. So Chris or myself or somebody comes out and we meet. Typically, I meet with either the superintendent admin team, or only the superintendent, or some cases the board policy subcommittee. And we go through the policy update and look at the options and discuss what's appropriate for them. And then whether it be from the superintendent or a board policy committee, a recommendation is made to the board as a whole about the policy changes. As a board, you have a first reading of policies. And that doesn't mean you stand up and you read the policy out loud from beginning to end. It's the first opportunity for the board to review it. And then you have a second reading of the policy. So the purpose of the first and second reading is to allow time for board members to ask questions about the recommendations and other people ask questions about the recommendations. After the second reading, policies are adopted or rejected by the board. And then we publish them to your electronic format. Historically, years ago, when it was paper that we used to do policy updates and it wasn't electronic, it took months to get things published. Now it's a matter of days from the time you adopt them to the time they're published. And one thing of note too, even before they're published, as soon as the board takes action to approve a policy, it is your policy whether it's been published yet or not. So sometimes people wonder about the time in between. Nope, when the board takes action, that policy becomes effective immediately.
The one thing I would add to this particular slide, just for your information, is that most of you likely have in your bylaws a statement that says in emergency situations, you can approve a policy on first reading. So if something comes up and your policy needs to be amended because maybe it's outdated, there's a critical situation that applies, you are able, per your own bylaws, to pass a policy on one reading.
We were almost in this situation a couple of years ago when it was the vaccine or test that was going to be required of everybody to work, and that was challenged at the Supreme Court and overturned. But it was a point where boards were going to have to make the adoption in a one meeting setting based upon the timeline of it. So fortunately, we never came to that, but that's an example of where time was of the essence because they were threatening fines if you don't adopt it by X date. So administrative guidelines. So this is the complement to policy. And this is the domain of the superintendent and the admin team. So they take what you adopt as a board as policy, and then they implement the rules by which you'll effectively accomplish those policies for the board. Think of them as the detail. And this is getting into the weeds of how you're going to run the school. And this is, again, the responsibility of the superintendent and the admin team. The board doesn't approve administrative guidelines. This is their job to administer your policies, and this is the means by which they do it. And the implementation is who does this, when, where, and how. As clear as that. And the guidelines are very detailed. But they're also very valuable, especially for an administrator coming into a new district. If you have well-written guidelines, they have a clear understanding of the process and procedures that the board has directed through policy and then implemented through guideline.
And important to to point out here, because I know that can make some board members a little bit apprehensive. It's important to know that if a guideline is associated with a policy, they are in alignment. That is how they are written. However, not every policy has a guideline. I think it's important to point that out. So just keep that in mind if someone says, where's the guideline? And if there are any questions about whether or not there is one, I think this is important for boards and superintendents to know, hey, is there a policy out there? Maybe we didn't adopt it, or is there a guideline out there? Let us know. We've got access to the full templates, and we can get that information over to the district for consideration.
So our Neola Policy Service, what do we do? So we provide comprehensive policy support. We're current. We're legally compliant in all cases, and everything that we offer you is a legally compliant option. And they're connected through policy, administrative guideline, and cross-reference within policy. And I know Chris touched on this earlier. I guess I'd like to emphasize too the practical support part of this. We take a lot of pride in the work we do with superintendents and admin teams in supporting them in policy when they have questions about what's been adopted. I pride myself on the fact that if you call me today, you'll get a call back today about this policy, and you won't have to wait and wonder where to go from there. And I know for a fact every one of our associates feels the same way about being very prideful about the work that we do. Having been school administrators, we've been in their shoes. We know what it's like to need an answer, and you don't have time to wait for a day or two.
Yeah, that's some great points, Pat. And you know, our goal as associates, we want to keep the district out of trouble. We want to keep you current compliant, but we also want to keep the district out of any kind of trouble. And so we can share our experiences, our expertise. You know, none of us are afraid to tell a superintendent or a board if we feel like they're making a mistake by maybe not selecting an option. You know, we're not going to tell you what you should and shouldn't adopt, but if I felt strongly on a particular topic, based on my experience, I would share that information with you.
So here's our content. So for policies, we have the zeros, we call them, the board bylaws, how the board will function. Then we have policies specific to the administration. And I usually lump the 1,000s, the 3,000s, the 4,000s together because that is different personnel groupings, policies relating to those groupings. And you might have identical policies in each one of those. I'll give you a great example. FMLA, that policy is virtually essential, or it's virtually identical for administration, instructional staff, and non-instructional staff, because that is driven by federal law. We have a programming section, our student section, which is very comprehensive. 6,000 is really critical for finance and audits, property, operations. Operations is a very comprehensive section as well as programming. I'll jump back there. Both of those sections are extremely comprehensive in terms of how you function as a school. And then lastly, not leastly, community relations and how you work with your community.
And some people find the duplicate policies in different sections as repetitive, but the reason that it's necessary is because our board docs platform, which is a slide coming up, has a search function. And if someone is dealing with a situation that involves a member of the instructional staff, you're going to look in that 3,000 section. You're going to want to find it there. If it's the non-instructional staff, you're going to want to find it there, or admin. You know, there are some that appear, some of the tobacco policies that we just updated appear in the personnel sections, but they also appear in the property sections, as does the weapon policy that's being updated in this go round. So repetitive, yes, but necessarily so.
So current. So we typically have 2 updates a year. I think Chris is about where I am. I'm just wrapping up the fall updates right now for my clients. We'll have a meeting in December to review the upcoming spring update. And then I believe around the 1st of February, the spring update is going to be released. And at that point in time, we'll start meeting with people again, going through the update, helping them make selections and recommendations. Typically the first update's around legislative changes. However, I think that's going to be different this year. The second update is going to be legislative heavy because of all the things that were done in the last 6 months in the legislature with respect to schools. We also have some best practice pieces that come up. And sometimes policy is driven by, it may not be legally required, but it is becoming an issue in schools. So we offer a best practice policy for schools, even though it may not be legally required. You don't have to take it, but it does provide guidance for people to work within the framework. So we meet with staff to review the recommended revisions and material. Every so often we'll do a special update. The most recent special update I can think of was Title IX, and that would have been in the fall of 2020. And it came out at a very odd time in between update cycles, and we needed to find a way to get it implemented for schools. And we are, we're the personal point of contact. Every school that I work with, I tell them, if you have a question, come to me first before contacting the home office, about policy, because likely I can help them with it. And we can also troubleshoot any issues you might be having with your publishing of your policies and the process of it. Anything to add, Chris?
No, thanks.
So compliant, Chris mentioned this before. We work with a state law firm, Barnum, out of Grand Rapids in Detroit. We also work with 2 national law firms, one out of Chicago and one out of Washington, D.C. Our policies are compliant both within the state statute as well as the federal statutes. And I think it's critical to know that we're looking at Michigan specific policies as well as federal specific policies. So we're meeting both ends of the guideline. They aren't generic to just the federal. Always paying attention to the pulse of what's going on in Michigan.
And again, the competitors that are out there are typically law firms, and so they've got their way of approaching that. But I think the beauty of our process here is that our law firm researches these things, and then there are a group of individuals associated with Neola, including the associates, that provide input as these policies are written. What might this look like in an applied sense? And is there anything that we're not seeing that we should be seeing from from somebody that's been in the seat and done the work? And through that process, we hope that we find something that really is helpful for the district. And again, as I mentioned, our goal is to keep you compliant and out of trouble.
It's interesting you brought that up, Chris. I actually have a meeting of the first vet of the next policy update next week, where I'm meeting with the attorneys, and we're going to talk about what the proposed changes are, and then I get to provide perspective on what's the real world application for schools with respect to policy. So Connected, Michigan Associates. We're a very proud partner of Michigan Association of School Board. We're their policy provider for MASB. We also have a strong partnership with the Superintendent's Association, MASA, the Michigan State Police. We've recently began a partnership with the Michigan Association of Secondary School Principals, and that partnership continues to grow. And interesting, this is a new one for us, but last summer we spent time working with SETSEG, who's a liability insurance company for most schools in Michigan. And they helped us provide some guidance on cybersecurity policy and guidelines, which was extremely helpful for our members as this becomes more and more of an issue for schools in terms of protecting their data from breaches and ransomware attacks.
And I would just emphasize that MASB partnership. Those of you that are your board members. So Brad Banasic with MASB, one of their legal counsel, has a very large presence in the public education scene in Michigan. People know Brad. Brad's accessible. It's very accessible to us, and has been a great resource. So, having that ability, and we talk a lot about, in most of our districts, our client districts, we do our work directly through superintendents. However, these are board policies. We represent you. And I know there are times when there might not be the level of trust that needs to exist between a board and a superintendent. Just please know that while we're working with superintendents, we are doing so with the best interest of the district and the Board of Education in mind.
So some other ways that we're connected, the Elementary Secondary Act, the Uniform Grant Guidance, that's really boring stuff. The grant guidance stuff, it's in the 6,000s, the financial stuff, but it's critical for you to be compliant with the law in terms of grants and your audit. Well, your auditor will ask for these every year. Can I see your policy about this? If you don't have that policy, they're going to question how did you actually apply this to your financial system. We also partner with the state police. So the state police comes in almost annually, I think now, and does an audit of your criminal justice information security, or when you do background checks on people, how you maintain the security of that data. And we've gone as far as the state police have essentially written this policy in AG for us, saying this is what we want to see when we come into your building. We happily work with them to publish this for our clients.
Yeah, and working with law enforcement has become increasingly important as we continue to make sure that our school safety policies are up to speed. We're getting a lot of input from the Michigan State Police, and working with them to ensure that those policies that school boards are adopting are written with the law in mind, and also with the law enforcement community in mind.
So I want to show you what the I'm going to pick on one of my districts, and I'll show you what their board doc site looks like. So what I'm looking for, 1 second. Here's your policy manuals. For example, There are all the bylaws that the board functions under. Every one of our clients has a portal just like this and a link to their policies. And as they're updated, we update them for them and they go live for the board. I was looking for this one right here. You notice this was revised a couple years ago. This was when we were revising the board operating procedures during meetings for things like how long can you talk, limiting abusive comments, things like that. So that there's also, and Chris mentioned this, a search feature. So I just searched FMLA, and here's every policy where FMLA shows up. So if somebody asked me a question about FMLA, I could say, oh, okay, so you're a professional staff member. Here's our FMLA policy, and here's how it's applied. Okay, so I just want to give you a taste of that. The other one comes up quite a bit is clubs. So use of facilities. So every place that you have a club, this club is listed, comes up. It narrows you down. You can also do a smarter search where you can do a semicolon and another word or an and. But just a basic search as a board member, and somebody asks you a question about policy, you don't have to know it offhand. As a matter of fact, when I was a superintendent, I certainly didn't know every policy chapter and verse, but I knew how to find the answer to that by going in here and using the search feature. Somebody says to me, what's your policy on smoking for staff members? I can go to the tobacco policy pretty quickly and get to the answer. And the other nice thing we can do with these is we can then make a link and send it directly to the person, a copy of the policy. We could email it to them if they didn't want to go in and look it up themselves. So.
And board members need to be, certainly aware of key policies, but to be, to memorize all of this is obviously just simply too much to ask. But here's something that some districts have done for your own considerations to help their board members be fully aware of what the policies are. And that would be to take the 10 sections that are here and to say, over the next 10 months, we're going to review each one of these sections one by one to identify if there are any discrepancies between practice and policy, and just to better inform board members about what's in that particular policy. It's tedious work, but it is something that can be valuable.
First thing I would tell any new board member as well, you need to read your bylaws before you go to your first meeting and understand how do we function as a board, because this is all about how you as a board function and how you vote with different types of meetings, special meeting, emergency meetings, regular meetings, how they're called. I mean, these are how you go into recess, what your agenda should look like, what a consent agenda is. These are all really important things to understand as a board. If you don't get to any other section of policy before you first begin as a board member, make sure you clearly understand your bylaws and how you're going to function as a board member.
And if you are a new board member and your district is not using consent agenda, this is me getting off script here a little bit. I'm a big proponent of it. For those of you that use it, it's a tremendous time saver where you don't have to have a resolution for every tiny little thing that the board's taking action on, including maybe support staff hires or things, coaching hires and things along those lines can be placed on consent agenda and handled with one resolution rather quickly.
And you can see the certain things in this policy for specific to the school, the things that they can do in consent with one action, the minutes of prior meetings, bills, hiring of personnel, some resolutions, resignations, and leaves. And you don't have to take individual action on each one of those based on this policy. Now, you may not have this in your current policy, but I would agree with Chris. I think it's an underused tool that boards have to use consent agenda to make some of these decisions. So, Larissa, are there any questions that anybody's asked at this point? Because I've got a few more slides.
Yeah, I can go through some of the questions, or you can keep going through your slides. It's up to you.
Why don't we just go through the rest of it, and then we'll just take all the questions at the end.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so current compliance is not enough. Just because you update your policies periodically, you also have to make sure that the people that use these policies know the policy. If the board adopts it and it's never communicated to the people that are supposed to implement it, it'll fail. quite frankly. The other part is you need to provide training to people in certain areas. For example, and here's the best one, and it's going to happen again, is when the new rules drop for Title IX, people will have to go through training again, a new set of training for Title IX. It's going to be a requirement of the new rules. And then implementing the administrative guidelines. And also as a district, this is more of an administrative task, but making sure your document compliance, really with respect to anytime you get an Office of Civil Rights complaint, you never have too much documentation. You only have too little. So the types of trainings that a board should be thinking about in terms of their employees is, anti-harassment training, administering of medications. That policy is 5330. I get that question a lot. So how are medications administered to students in school, and what's the process for that? Public records training, that gets a little bit back to the state police audit there. Professional misconduct, ethics, suicide prevention. Obviously, I mentioned Title IX. Some other topics that come up in terms of training for staff, bullying. So child abuse, this is an interesting one. Mandatory reporting by school employees is a big deal in terms of any child abuse suspicion. Excuse me. And I've known superintendents to lose their jobs over this, where they didn't have staff mandatory report, or they themselves did not mandatory report suspected child abuse. Now we have wellness and safety, which have been big hot topics the last couple of years. This EpiPen is a newer phenomenon the last decade or so. There's also a policy that we have that I would say about half my districts have taken it and half have not, and it's about opioid antagonists, or Narcan, and the administration of it if you choose to do that as a school. Like I said, half my districts have taken the policy and they have a plan to administer if necessary, and the other half have not and have chosen really to rely on medical services, EMTs if necessary, or police.
Just a quick comment here, Pat. A couple of different things on the training piece. There is going to be some mandatory reporter training that's going to be required for school employees coming down, and I don't know what that's going to look like, but my guess is that it probably will take the form of a Safe Schools module. And many of you are SETSEG clients and have access. That's how you do your compliance training, your bloodborne pathogens, and those types of things. So you may see that there. But another link back to our partnerships and the training piece on technology use. This current update that we're doing right now has several administrative guidelines that are being updated on technology use and cybersecurity that really raise the level of awareness and knowledge that school districts have to have with respect to cybersecurity incidents. For example, things that used to say IT personnel need to be aware of the policies now say all users need to be aware of the policies. And again, this is all due to ransomware attacks that seem to be on the rise, definitely are. And so those are, even though they're in the AGs, there are related policies, and it's very important that districts are doing what they say they're going to be doing per those policies and AGs.
And interesting with respect to technology, so there was a ransomware attack last year that took down 2 counties, one ISD and another ISD another county that they provided services to, and they were down for over a week, no school because of the ransomware attack. So that's the rationale and the push now for insurance companies wanting to be involved early if there's ever a ransomware attack, because they partner with experts, third parties in the field that deal with only ransomware attacks. So the sooner you involve your insurance company, whether it's SETSEG or somebody else, the more likely is you won't have as damaging of an attack. There we go, Larissa.
All right, I'll go in order of the questions that we got. So the first one is, could you address the pros, cons of more broad policy to allow for more leeway in administrative guidelines? Should policy be more specific or more broad?
I'll start. I guess I would say policy is more broad in general, and administrative guidelines are more detailed in general. The only danger with a very broad and I guess maybe even murky board policy that isn't clear is it's hard to apply a guideline to that then. But I tend to lean on administrative guidelines for the detail of how policies are implemented. Some policies stand alone. They're written so in detail, you don't need an administrative guideline for you. I'll give you a recent one. The Fair Labor Standards Act is very specific about how, as a district, you treat nursing mothers. It's so specific, it really isn't necessary to have an administrative guideline because it says you will do this, this, and this. If Chris, you want to add anything to that?
I do. It's kind of a related comment that the board members, the most common question they ask during readings of new policies or updated policies is this required? And the thing that I always want to point out to people when you're looking at any policy, a current policy, a new policy, a revised policy, is to look at the very bottom. And if you see legal references there, you know it's based on law. You see CFR, that's Code of Federal Regulations, it's based on federal law. If you see MCL, that's Michigan compiled laws. And when you see those things, you know that they're based on law. And if they are, they could end up being a little more detailed. But again, it's that point of, okay, we've got to have this information there to make sure that we are compliant and that our administrators have the guidance that they need.
Does Neola provide a free service to advise in policy committee meetings for initial review or recommendation?
Free service. Well, the service we provide are the update visits that we come out on, and those take different shapes. Sometimes I meet, like I mentioned earlier, with the board subcommittee. Sometimes I meet just with the superintendent or the superintendent and the admin team. I have one group I meet with where I meet with about 12 people, all the union leadership, the superintendent, couple board members. Again, they take on a very different, it's part of our service. The visit is part of our service. How that takes shape is really how I work with my clients. Chris has a different experience than I have.
Yeah, and I would, I would just add here that as clients, what some districts aren't aware is that as a subscriber to Neola with our 2 updates, you get 3 hours of associate time. Now that includes our prep time, reviewing your policies. If you're a select client, we may be doing some edits for you or doing all of your edits for you. And that includes the meeting time that we have as well. And as Pat said, it takes various forms. Sometimes it's with the superintendent who then meets with the policy committee. Sometimes it's the superintendent going back to the full board. And in some cases, it's the full board meeting directly with the associate. So a lot of different ways that can take the form of, and it really gets down to local preference.
And I would say over 95% of mine is me meeting with the superintendent who then goes on to meet with the policy committee with the recommendations that they're making to the policy committee.
Why do policies sometimes reference AGs when the board doesn't have control over the AGs?
Indirectly, the board does have control over the AGs by the policy you set. The admin, their job is to take what the board adopts in policy and provide detail to that, not in contrary to what the board did, only in support of what the board did.
And, again, the policies are adopted by the board, but the users are the people who are administering those things on a day-to-day basis. So, you're anyone that might access it, it needs to know the policy and the AG. And the other thing that's being added right now to policies as they're being updated is we're starting to add cross references. There may be multiple AGs that connect to a single policy, and to give users that ability to track down everything that might be associated is important.
What does a proactive board look like relative to policy? I am interested in understanding how a progressive board supports their district administrative team proactively and not just reviewing and adopting periodic required updates with optional language. Specifically, how to stay in front of current or emerging issues that warrant either policy updates or new policy.
Probably the best way a board can stay proactive is keeping up with their updates. The challenges that I run into with districts is that they don't always proactively continue updating policies. And since we're meeting, so the fall update comes out September, October-ish. and then February, March for the spring. We have that window of time in there where we're making those policy templates for you to consider. As a board, if you want to be proactive, I guess you could start reviewing, as Chris mentioned before, reviewing your current policies. I pay attention to legal updates that are coming out. You get some foreshadowing of what may be coming. But I'll mention too that policy review that Chris mentioned. I will caution you, that is a very labor-intensive process for you to review all of your policies. I would take them in bites. If I was a board member and I really wanted to be versed on all policy, I would take them in small bites and review them that way. Because keep in mind, these policies have been updated by different boards and different administrator recommendations over the years. It isn't the same group that's reading them right now or the ones that adopted them originally. So the review of them, again, take your time. It's not something that can be done in a week or a month. It's a very intensive process as a board.
Can you share best practices in addressing homes with weapons within 1,000 yards of school buildings?
You want to take that one, Chris?
Yeah, that's very interesting that topic comes up. There is, to my knowledge, absolutely no legal recourse on the part of a school with respect to premises that are not their own. As a matter of fact, there is a weapons update policy right now that includes a couple of Supreme Court precedent setting cases that have occurred. And one of the options in your weapons policy, which is 7217, it's an exception to the possession policy, says lawfully owned weapons in a locked vehicle in your parking lots. And what some people don't realize is, although you can pass a policy stating that will not be allowed, the law does allow that. The law does not include parking lots as part of your premises, believe it or not. So not only homes that are close by, but even your parking lots. Now, if you pass policy that says, no, we don't allow that, an individual who is known to possess that weapon could be asked to leave. And if they didn't, they could be charged with trespassing, but they're not going to be charged with a gun crime by law enforcement. That's the current state of the law as interpreted, as written, and also interpreted by the Michigan State Police.
And as I understand it too, the 1,000-foot boundary for weapons-free school zone is a federal law. Law enforcement are not going to go into people's homes and check to see if they have a weapon if they are within 1,000 feet of the school. So the enforceability of that is difficult. The one thing it does open it up for is if there was a violation or some sort of crime committed, it opens up to federal charges, not just state charges.
The last one we have right now is, could you expand on policies being the domain of the board? In our district, the SOUP calls the meeting of the policy committee, runs the meeting, and then suggests their choice and reports out to the board. Is that overstepping?
I don't believe that's overstepping. I do work with the School Board Association too on governance. In terms of the roles of the board and the superintendent, the role of the superintendent is to make recommendations to the board about a whole variety of things, including policy. The domain of the board, what that means to me is that it is ultimately up to the board to decide whether or not they want to accept that recommendation and approve it or reject it. That's what it means by domain to me. And I make that distinction very clear. I think an essential role of a superintendent is to make recommendations to the board. And it's the board's responsibility what they do with that.
And best practice there would be that when the superintendent's making recommendations, that the board sees all options that are being presented as part of that update. They're your policies, and yes, the superintendent can say, we believe this is in our best interest, but you're the ones that get to make that final decision. And so make sure that if your templates are being presented, that you are seeing all of the options that are available to you as a board.
We had one more question, and it's, can you discuss any policies related to artificial intelligence?
We do not have a specific artificial intelligence policy. However, we have acceptable use agreements for staff and students that include language about the appropriate use of artificial intelligence. That's where it's addressed in policy currently. We've been kind of back and forth about the appropriateness of having a very specific artificial intelligence policy. I think there may be one coming in the future, given really it's been less than a year since this really blew up onto the scene. I know that districts with respect to students have sought to address this through their academic honesty policy in student handbooks. So on how you deal with students who may be academically dishonest by using AI, which, to be honest with you, I don't know yet, and I don't think anybody knows what is academic dishonesty with respect to AI, short of somebody just asking a prompt and handing in a paper without ever looking at it. When you start editing it, something that's generated by AI, when does it become yours? So those are questions that need to be answered, not by policy so much, but more as society. When is it mine?
Yeah, that might be the most rapidly evolving issue that we're faced with right now. So stay tuned, and as we learn more and we feel that it translates into a policy update, Neola will be on top of that.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Pat and Chris, for the great presentation. As a reminder, we will be sending out a recording of this and a copy of the slides next week. For anyone who will be joining us at the annual leadership conference over the weekend, we look forward to seeing you there. And we hope to see you also at the final webinar in the new board member series, which is on December 13th.
Thank you for the opportunity.